Vladimir Putin has clearly upped the ante. The Russian president has made his much anticipated next move in the Ukraine war. On Wednesday, while addressing the nation, Vladimir Putin gave a call for partial military mobilization for the Ukraine war, which essentially means more troops would be sent to the front lines. This move has enraged many Russians, though. From Moscow to St. Petersburg, people have come out on the streets in thousands, decrying the war and protesting against the call for mobilization. Protests have been held in more than 30 cities across Russia now. People carrying banners and chanting slogans against the order of the Russian president can be seen all across that country.
You know, it has all been done so quickly that questions arise regardless of one's opinion. So to speak, how measured and well considered it is.
I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid of anything. The most valuable thing that they can take from us is the lives of our children. I won't give them a child's life.
Well, protests such as these are a rare sight. In Russia, any form of dissent in the country is usually dealt with firmly, and any criticism of the Russian military is seen as a highly punishable offense. Now, according to reports, more than 1,300 protesters have been held across the country. While there were protests and hundreds of arrests at home, Western leaders tore into the Russian president at the United Nations General Assembly.
This war is about extinguishing Ukraine's right to exist as a state, plain and simple, and Ukraine's right to exist as a people. Whoever you are, wherever you live, whatever you believe, that should make your blood run cold.
Attack on our neighbor and friend, Ukraine. It is an attack on the rules-based international order. It is an attack on nuclear safety. It is an attack on food supplies to countries in the Middle East and Africa.
The West has denounced Putin for making overt nuclear threats against Europe as part of his latest escalation bid, and warned that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought.
But what would NATO do if Russia used a nuclear weapon on Ukraine?
We will make sure that there is no misunderstanding in Moscow about the seriousness of using nuclear weapons. Exactly how we will react, of course, depends on what kind of situation and what kind of weapons they may use. The most important thing is to prevent that from happening. And that's the reason why we have been so clear in our communications with Russia about the unprecedented consequences, about the fact that the nuclear war cannot be won by Russia.
Canada condemns Putin's irresponsible escalation of the war, his partial military mobilization, his nuclear threats, as well as Russia's rushed referendums to try to annex parts of Ukraine are unacceptable. Putin's behavior only goes to show that his invasion is failing.
For more on this developing story, we're now joined by Dmitry Babich, a political analyst. He joins us from Moscow. Mr. Babich, thanks very much for speaking to WION. Now, what did you make of the timing of Putin's announcement of this partial military mobilization, which amongst other things entails drafting almost 300,000 reservists to support Russia's military campaign in Ukraine? While most see this as a brazen escalation and yet another provocation by Putin, at least the West sees it that way, would it be correct to say that the move suggests a degree of desperation on Putin's part, as his troops are actually believed to be fast losing ground in Ukraine?
Well, I certainly can agree that this move is not voluntary. And of course, these 300,000 reservists, they are not going to be sent to the army tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. It will be a long process because people will be retrained. for the high-tech war that we're seeing developing in Ukraine, unfortunately. But I would put it all in context. First, read Putin's speech carefully. President Biden lied in the United Nations when he said that Putin threatened the West with a nuclear weapon. Putin said that if the Western countries intervene in Ukraine, if we see NATO troops there, then Russia would defend itself and the territories which will become, obviously, after these referendums, parts of Russia. Russia will defend these territories by all means possible, including, of course, nuclear weapons. As for their involvement of the Western countries in the war in Ukraine, there is no question about it. They are openly sending all the most sophisticated modern weapons to kill Russian soldiers. The European diplomacy's leader, Josep Barroso, openly said that the fate of this war will not be decided at the negotiating table, it will be decided at the battleground. I'm quoting him. So that kind of makes the situation at least a little more complicated than the Western leaders presented. As for the referendums and the timing of these referendums and of Putin's mobilization, of course, it follows the escalation by the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainian side started its offensive. And in the two towns which they managed to take back from the Russian troops, they immediately cracked down on all the people who took humanitarian aid from Russia, who participated in any form of government activity. People have been imprisoned, they disappear. Only in the last 3 months, 21 pro-Russian officials, Ukrainian citizens, on the territories controlled by Russia were killed by assassination squads sent by the Kiev government, and this is openly admitted by the Kiev government. So in this situation, put yourself in the shoes of the people living in these regions. You know, I know a lot of them. I have relatives there. They say to the Russian government very openly, make your choice. Either make us a part of Russia and then defend us, or leave us to this regime in Kiev, with which we lived very badly. We were persecuted, but we lived with it.
Okay. You know, of course, Russia and Ukraine both accuse each other of engaging in war crimes. The West clearly sees Russia as the aggressor here. And it's interesting you accused President Biden of lying when he accused Putin of holding out a nuclear threat. Now, the reason why that allegation has been made is because the Russian president has vowed to use all means available to defend Russia. And therefore, the question that's being asked is this nuclear saber rattling and essentially a warning to the West? Or do you believe that Putin is playing to his domestic audience?
I think it's primarily for the foreign audience, not for the domestic audience. But I think it's wrong to call it a threat. All the countries that have nuclear weapons, they openly say that we keep these weapons to protect our territory if foreign troops or troops from an organization which is hostile to us, if we see them entering our territory, we may use this terrible weapon. Of course, Putin doesn't plan to use nuclear weapons. He understands that this would be the end of human civilization. He is not insane, but he wants to warn the Western countries. So far, they went very far in their support of Ukraine. Remember how President Obama was wary even of sending any lethal weapons to help Ukraine when the legally elected President Yanukovych was ousted by the current rulers of Ukraine, and they started basically a civil war against the Russian minority in the east. It was the Kiev government that started that war in 2014. It was not Russia. So basically, Putin is sending a message. These territories, the population there, we want to protect it. We see how it is being bombed by Western weapons, and we will protect this population as soon as these territories become part of Russia. These people will have all the rights which the Russian citizens have, and they will be protected by all the might that Russia has. And you know, my impression, I traveled in these regions. I actually have, as I told you, many friends and relatives there. They all say that we don't want the front line to move. We want to be with Russia, if possible, because we are Russian speakers, we are ethnically Russian,
okay,
or leave us alone and leave us to Ukraine, but don't move the front line. The problem is that the Ukrainian counteroffensive moved the front line,
okay,
and that means a lot
having
of
said
casualties.
that, Mr. Babish, having said that, the referendums are controversial, and but you're very clear that what Putin has said is an unequivocal message to Western powers: do not meddle in the Ukraine war, not any further. Final question before we let you go. We know that massive protests are taking place across Russia right now. We're witnessing almost unprecedented scenes in that country right now. Keeping that in mind, where do you really see things going from here?
Well, I mean, I live in Moscow, and I was in the center yesterday for all of these hours. I tried to find these so-called protests. Listen, there are 14 million people living in Moscow. If 4,000 of them or 5,000 of them are on the streets, this is not going to be a problem for the government. In Russia, very few people take part in public protests. That's a tradition. These protests are not so badly forbidden as the Western media presents it. But compared to Karachi or compared to New Delhi, you know, Russia is a very quiet place in terms of public protests. So these protests are not going to be a problem for the government. Draft evasion, you know, some reservists may try to avoid draft. That's true, because the war in Ukraine is very bloody. It is fought by terrible Western weapons which destroy you at long distances, which are very, very devastating and cruel. People are afraid, of course. They may try to avoid the draft. But the general mood in Russia is that we need to protect the Russians on the Ukrainian territory. We can't leave them, because that will put them in the situation of the Hindu minority in Pakistan. These people would simply be reduced to almost zero by the hostile government in Ukraine.
All right. It's interesting to have your perspective from Moscow. You're saying these protests are really not going to be much of a headache for Putin, but could the order regarding the draft become a bit of a challenge? And also, fact of the matter is that such protests are quite rare, if not unprecedented, in that country. How will this pan out? We will find out in the days and weeks ahead. Dmitry Babish, thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us here on WION. At this point, we are now also joined by Oleksiy Melink, who is the co-director of Foreign Relations and International Security Programs at the Razumkov Center in Ukraine's capital, Kiev. Thanks so much for joining us. Let me begin by asking you, how is Kiev looking at Putin's call for mass mobilization? President Zelensky, while addressing the UN General Assembly, of course, has once again called for the global community to impose tougher sanctions on Russia and provide further military assistance to Ukraine. Do you really see that happening?
Yesterday's decision of President Putin to declare this partial mobilization, as well as the decision to conduct a referendum on temporary occupied territories, was commented by officials and independent experts in Ukraine. But I can tell you that it was not like a breaking news throughout even a day. It's not a good news regarding the perspectives of the conflict resolution, because definitely Russia in big trouble, but Russia still have huge reserves. And even if the Russian government succeeds in gathering these 300,000 reservists, they will appear on the front line probably in terms of weeks or months, and it will complicate the situation further. But as was mentioned by Ukrainian officials, and again, many experts, that it will not change the things on the ground, because Ukraine is eager and Ukraine is willing to defend its sovereign territory, and no matter what Russia does, it will just prolong the conflict. It will produce more violence, more casualties, but it is not going to change the general course of the war.
Okay. Mr. Melink, I want to ask you this. Some experts have questioned the efficacy of sending reservists to the front lines, pointing to the retreats and slow progress by the rather well-trained Russian troops that we've seen so far in the Ukraine war. What is your view on that? Some wonder if this decision by Putin could in fact even backfire. But at the same time, President Zelensky has repeatedly reached out to Western leaders, saying the West must be more militarily involved. He's hinted repeatedly that there is a need for boots on the ground, something that the Western powers have so far steered clear of. Do you think that could change in the next phase of this war?
Just probably weeks or a couple of months ago, there was kind of this common assessment that Ukraine has enough manpower but lacks weapons. And Russia had enough weapons but was having problem with the manpower. Now I think the situation is changing, because with more and more weapons provided by our partners, Ukraine is more capable to deliver results, and we saw it during the last weeks with quite successful counteroffensive operation. I think that the time is working on the Ukrainian side, because we now have about 1 million people in uniform in the army, National Guard, territorial defense, etc., and with more weapons coming from the West, we will be able to progress even further. I don't think that the Russians, even if they create or send more people to the battlefield, they will not solve the problem of lacking equipment, because now a lot of equipment was destroyed, was out of order, and Russia has no other sources because no partners how to compensate the losses on the battleground. So we are quite optimistic. And also, I listened to your previous speaker. I think the Russians are missing one very important point, because the Russians have their problems in Ukraine, and they have problems in Ukraine. Not invited them in Ukraine, just pull out of Ukraine and your soldiers will be alive. There will be no problems that you are discussing now.
All right. Finally, Mr. Milling, do you see this war significantly escalating, given this latest move by Putin? How worried is Kiev following this decision? Even though you say that your, Western friends and allies are stepping up to offer greater assistance to Ukraine, but is there a real worry of an escalation at this stage?
Definitely. We have these signs of escalation, and the President Putin's speech is actually one of the objectives was to escalate, or to give these warning signals to Ukrainians, first of all, to the Western community, to make them scared with possible Russian actions, up to probably using nuclear weapons on the battlefield. And also Russia, despite all the problems with the generating effective manpower, of course, they still have a lot of instruments to create problems, like man-made disasters, even on the nuclear power plant, and that definitely bothers us. And but at the end of the day, as I said, Russia has lost this war from the very beginning, and just for very simple reason, because you can't do in the 21st century this kind of colonial war. They are talking about liberation, but actually this is occupation. And even if Russia declares these territories that being Russian territory, it doesn't change anything. It's still Ukrainian territory, even the Crimea Peninsula. Nobody in the world, almost nobody in the world, recognizes these territories as territories belonging to Russia.
All right. It's interesting you say the referendums won't change anything, certainly not the geopolitical reality of that region. We'll really have to wait and see how that pans out. And while you believe that Russia has been losing this war, fact of the matter is that the war is well and truly on, and at this point poised for a major escalation. On that note, Alexei Milling, Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.